Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hey.
My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here tonight with some of my other collective mates to have a conversation with anarchist artist and illustrator Bonzo about their beautifully illustrated update of Peter Kropotkin's seminal work, Mutual Aid, an Illuminated Factor of Evolution. Before we dive in, for folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're a general interest bookstore, but are perhaps more widely known for our eclectic mix of titles related to feminism, anarchism, queerness, social movements, and other radical politics. We ship books all across the country, and if you haven't checked us out, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, since the start of the pandemic, we've transitioned our community programming entirely to an online virtual space and will continue hosting virtual events until it is otherwise safe to do so. Notably, next Tuesday, December 21st, we'll be hosting an event on Black anarchism and abolition with author and activist William C. Anderson for the release of his new book, The Nation on No Map. So if you're interested in attending that event or staying informed about other events happening through Firestorm, I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And tonight, like I mentioned earlier, we're here with multiple members of the Firestorm Collective as we get the opportunity to chat with one of our favorite artists, Bonzo. So maybe I'll take a moment here to let Firestorm introduce themselves. So like I said earlier, I'm Ash, I use they, them pronouns, and I do a community event coordination for Firestorm.
Hi, I'm Liberty, also with Firestorm, famous for hating art. So tonight I'll be trying to make up my mind as whether or not art really does have any place in the movement. So no pressure, Bonzi, but I'm excited to be here and maybe you'll change my mind.
I'm Glenda. I am also the community events co-coordinator, and this is my first event. I am brand new with the collective, pretty much on my third week, and I'm very excited to be here with y'all and to chat with Bonzo.
Cool, thanks so much, y'all. With that, we can dive in. So after some 2.5 years of work, PM Press just released Bonzo's updated illustrated version of Peter Kropotkin's 1902 work, Mutual Aid, an Illuminated Factor of Evolution. Bonzo, we're so excited to be here with you tonight and hear more about this project. And I'm wondering if we want to start just by allowing you to introduce yourself and tell viewers who might not be familiar who exactly Peter Kropotkin was and what is this book about?
And I'm so excited to be here tonight, virtually, of course. I honestly really can't wait for the pandemic, for all of us to have a lot more safety during it and to be able to actually come and visit Firestorm in person. That's going to be just such a wonderful time. So for a little bit, for folks who are unfamiliar with Kropotkin, he passed away about 100 years ago. That's something that I think we should start with. This is actually the 100-year anniversary of his death. And so I think maybe a number of people have maybe even caught that there's been, like conferences and many reflections and like thoughts on the impact he had. So he was born a Russian prince within Tsarist Russia. And he very quickly rejected his title to become a revolutionary, seeking a society based on freedom, equality, and solidarity. One thing that's often, sometimes I think like left out is that he was also like a very prominent geographer at the time. He was very loved and respected within the Russian sciences. And a lot of his impact today is even felt specifically within the sciences. His work, resonated out far, far, far beyond just even like anarchist kind of like spaces. So he's a very prominent thinker for his time. And, we see that we're still talking about him 100 years later, right? He was also a very prolific writer. Like, if anybody has seen, PM has also just released The Great French Revolution. It's like, 900 pages or something, and the type is really nice and small too. So he has a number of works on history, on science, on anarchism, on ethics, morality, the state. And he also has a biography entitled Words of a Rebel that PM's also coming out with, that is also kind of a tale of his life and his numerous times imprisoned for his anarchism and his activism. It's a really delightful little book, especially it has a pretty detailed account of his prison escape, which is highly enjoyable to anybody who ever finds out like how intense this person's prison escape was. So in terms of the one work that we're kind of talking on tonight, Mutual Aid initially was was a series of essays that were published, I think, over a couple-year time period in response to some essays from a person named Huxley, so-called Darwin's Bulldog. And these essays were kind of one of the seminal critiques of the hypothesis of competition as the basis of so much evolution and social arrangement and organization. And they created, a huge and ongoing conversation that we see today and had quite a profound impact on both the sciences and just like anarchism as well at the time.
Yeah, thank you for kind of grounding us in that. So, the anarchism has a rich history and lots of texts that can be pointed to for people who want to learn more about it. So I'm curious to ask, why did you decide to illustrate this book, and what made you think it was like the right book for our historical moment and what's happening in the world today?
Yeah. And I like kind of what you mentioned too, of like, we have so many books that could be illustrated, because we have so many books that could be illustrated for anyone out there who also wants to illustrate books or zines or anything. Like, it'd be cool if we had a lot of these. For this text in particular, as you noted, it was, I started this a long time ago, right? And I had just been having some conversations with folks, and mutual aid had been coming up every now and then. And, somebody had asked me like, oh, what do anarchists mean by mutual aid? And I had literally just found a PDF online and like sent them a screenshot, right, of just like the beginning of the book. And then I went to look about like what copies were currently available. And outside of Freedom Press's version, everything was this like direct to print, kind of like Amazon.com, version, which are, if anyone's seen these, they're absolutely horrifying, have pixelated covers. The paper is just like, oh, it's so awful. The text, just like every single choice about it, you're just like, I'm horrified by this book. And they're not even cheap, right? Like, there's still the cost of like a nicely produced book. So I had been chatting with a member of PM Press when we were kind of bored and tabling somewhere together. I mentioned like, oh, I want to do this little pamphlet and just illustrate, these first 2 chapters on animals and like draw, rats helping each other escape from little traps and stuff. And they were like, well, why not the whole book? And then it just all, went downhill from there. So, when I started this project, I don't think any of us could have really guessed what was going to happen. In the meanwhile, I think some folks were like, look, we've been preparing for a worldwide pandemic, we've been projecting what would happen, but I don't think many of us could have actually guessed what we were going to see happen worldwide. So I began working on it in the long ago, before COVID, if there even is a thing anymore of before COVID. So I live in Portland, Oregon, so-called Portland, Oregon, which is occupied Chinook territory. And so especially here, we were watching a reinvigorated fascist movement on our street, seeing the increase, seeing all over the world, the increase of the ongoing violence of borders and just the almost indescribable tear of climate chaos. So just, that looming wide scale environmental destruction. And especially being in the Pacific Northwest, folks are kind of projecting that this is going to be a climate refuge and that we're going to potentially be seeing millions upon millions of climate refugees coming in, who we all have, an absolute responsibility in the Pacific Northwest to create space for. And, so looking at all of these different kind of like conflicts and crises and needs that, already exist, but are also going to be arising, I think that this book is just kind of like a really nice, simple articulation for one of the possibilities we have in addressing or facing any type of crisis that comes. The state and its buds are not going to be addressing any of this in any way that remotely works to address human need, or doesn't end up merely being a violent articulation of white supremacy, transphobia, classism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're the only ones who really have the potential to do that in a way that actually has a chance at creating more egalitarian ways of being in relation to each other and the living things that are around us. And I finished the illustrations about 3 months after the first lockdown notice. And, so while I'm finishing the illustrations for it, I'm seeing, worldwide that people are enthusiastically working to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, right? Folks were choosing to mask, taking precautions to lessen spread, supporting people in their needs, in having their needs for food met, in accessing their medications, and making sure that people are being checked on, just organizing kind of truly spectacular methods through a variety of formats that actually did mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, while the government is just like, leaving everyone to die and yelling on about the economy and declaring random towns anarchist districts. So even though when I started this, we were already facing any number of crises, we got so many more crises in the meanwhile. But we also got to see that so many people, most people, really did make a decision to cooperate and to take care of each other. And we're only going to be seeing, more crises come up in the future. So, this book as an articulation for a possibility of how to meet those crises, I think just like works even better kind of now.
Wow, yeah, I really love and appreciate that answer and how the book is, it's not just like a reprint, but it's actually something that can like serve folks who are doing work on the ground right now in this moment. And I totally agree. Like we at Firestorm, we stock the pixelated cover version of this book, and it is very exciting to have something else to give people who come in and want a text that is accessible and sort of roots them in some anarchist theory and practice. So yeah, much appreciation to you and Creativity Press for dreaming this up. I'm curious to ask, I know like you have done the illustrations for this, but there's other folks who contributed to this updated version. So would you be able to talk a little bit about who some of the other contributors to this update were and are, and kind of what makes this version of the book unique.
Oh yeah. So just in terms of what makes it unique, it's the first copy to ever be indexed. Hey, like that's a big deal. It's also larger. It's 8.5 by 11. But in terms of contributors, which is like more important, so I think for most folks, they already recognize the name David Graeber. After this year, we experienced his very sudden passing and the just like overwhelming outpouring of grief and loving remembrances that accompanied his passing, along with the release of his work co-authored with David Wingro, which I also know Firestorm stocks, and I'm sure it's, you know, close to a bunch of people in their homes right now. I've been seeing lots of people pick that up, and that's really great. Along with David Graeber, he co-wrote a piece with Andrej Grubacic, who is also absolutely fantastic. Andrej is the founding chair of the Anthropology and Social Change department at the, oh goodness, I'm so bad with, it's the California Institute for Integral Studies, yes, in San Francisco. He's also a prolific writer himself. I highly recommend folks check out any number of his several works. He's also the editor of the Kairos imprint over at PM. Ruth Kinna is also contributed a piece. She is a phenomenal historian, like truly great. So many times I've been looking for some context on a thing and it's like, oh, cool, Ruth Kinna wrote this like 250-page book on this like simple question I had, and now I can like dive into it really deep. She also, you know, has a number of works for folks to check out, and she edits the peer-reviewed journal Anarchist Studies based in the UK. They're constantly putting up these great little videos too, if folks are just kind of wanting like 20-minute explorations of some theory. And then who I'm also really excited about, because you have Graeber, Grubacic, and Kinna coming from this like history and theory point, you also have contributions from Allan Antliff and from Gatz. So Allan Antliff is super cool. He studies anarchist art and history. And the best part about him is he has a twin brother who also studies anarchist art and history. And so you can get books from both of them on anarchy and art. Allan's brother also has some really interesting works too on looking at like the aesthetic of fascism, which I think are really interesting and I've really enjoyed. And Allan is based up in so-called Victoria, up in Canada, has a number of different things that you can access. And then there is Gatz, who is not only kind of one of the most compassionate people you'll ever meet, but also like an incredibly prolific graffiti artist. So for folks on the West Coast, you've probably bumped into a piece of Gatz's that has like vandalized something you've walked by. So just a really wonderful vandal. And the five of them really contribute so much to this text, and in a variety of different ways, not only its place within current and historical kind of conversations, but also like what is the place of art during the time that Kropotkin wrote it too. And then Gatz is just like a loving reflection on just like how a person, you know, how just like a person experiences that book as like kind of a young punk. So yeah, really grateful to have them on.
Yeah, that's really great. It's quite the list of contributors, and it makes for just a really exciting update. And you mentioned sort of the context of anarchism and art, and we're gonna swing back to that later in the conversation. But perhaps at this point, it would make sense to just like focus in on the text a little bit more. I'm curious to ask Bonzo, like, was there anything that you feel like you especially learned in the process of working on this project, specifically about Kropotkin, or from mutual aid, from the text itself, that you didn't really have like a sense for, or that you didn't know prior to beginning the project?
Oh yeah. So I actually kind of goofily did like a lot of different reading just while doing this text. So I read the text exhaustingly like 9 or 10 times, illustrating it, which in retrospect, I did not need to do that whatsoever. So yay me. But I also kind of like, would get interested in things and kind of like run around and look at different, like correspondences that Kropotkin had, or like, what did people think about this book? What did people think about Kropotkin? And, through studying actually the relationship with Kropotkin to other folks, I kind of found like a lot of things that I'm really drawn to about him. He had his own interest in creative and crafting things. And he was also this like very rough and tumble, fight the cops type of dude, which I think we often don't talk about, is like Kropotkin, got into street brawls with police. Like that is not something we generally think about when we think about our theorists. So just like old, black bloc type of dude. He was also apparently a very accomplished illustrator himself. I've only been able to find one piece of art of his, which fatefully enough was a view of Kronstadt just a few years before the horrors of the Red Terror befell the sailors there, which is like a very kind of loving remembrance piece. And even just like these kind of little like nerdy things about him, like the last photos we have of him shot before his death are, he's standing at this desk he made himself and he really loves it. I found out he was missing a bunch of teeth from having a sickness in prison, which I'm also somebody who's missing teeth. And when you find that out about somebody else, it's like seeing somebody wearing the same shirt on the street, but times like a million. Like it's so exciting. I found all of these like lovely little remembrances that you would like sometimes run into the kitchen to ensure to thank somebody because they had washed a plate from him. And just those like really itty bitty things that kind of make figures who are really elevated to these kind of hero statuses so much more real and tangible. And helpful is seeing them as participants within kind of like a huge scene full of thousands and thousands of people, spanning so many different like countries and nations, like a huge transnational scene, who were all kind of constantly in conversation, agreement, conflict with each other, and also had their own kind of like, things going on that they were navigating. And, like I mentioned in the introduction, just even reading about his prison escape and stuff like that, like really just breathes so much life into like him and the people who were around him's lives. And just like a picture of a really sweet and also very fiery man emerges, who's kind of like deeply loved by people, even when they utterly disagreed with him, right? We all have those people who were like, I utterly disagree with you, but I love you. So it kind of, what I found out through doing all of this research was interestingly just more breathing like a full human life into Kropotkin.
Cool. Well, picking up from there, I've got a couple more questions about the content of the book and Kropotkin. You already mentioned that the text itself was written as a rebuke to social Darwinism. But I guess I'd be interested to hear more about how the text was originally received on the left, both by anarchists or by Marxists or others who were contemporary to Kropotkin.
Yeah, and I really want to appreciate Ruth Kinna's scholarship on this. So I think that, like, as far as I'm aware, right, there's 1,000 people out there who I haven't read who might have done cooler stuff, but Ruth, it just happens to be the one I read. But Ruth Kinna actually has a really extensive scholarship where she's gone through and read many of the letters from Kropotkin in terms of like what he was responding to. So the first and most obvious of is that social Darwinism one. But I think one of the things we sometimes miss when we even talk about it being a response to social Darwinism is that in Huxley's essay that he was responding to, so I think a lot of people are familiar with Huxley's essay because it's very like, trumpety, red tooth and claw, a battle against all for all. But like Huxley's conclusions from this, and many of the conclusions that were being drawn from social Darwinism at the time, is that we needed something supernatural to try and suppress, you know, that quote unquote, like heavy scare quotes, natural human condition of violence and struggle, right? So the only way that you can even contain this, you know, essentialist, like human and animal instinct is to have the biggest state ever. And this is still something we see today, right? Like, I think like everybody can be like, yes, I have seen people use social Darwinism, or at least that core concept, to justify a state a million times, or, you know, police anything else, like any of the apparatus of the state. So you have a response to that being like, oh ho ho, look at this mutual aid tendency over here, it's everywhere. And oh ho ho, further, you know, the state and relationships of coercion and hierarchy are actually what causes the most significant disruption to this tendency. And do another thing to add, like Kropotkin was actually carrying on a conversation that, at least within the Russian sciences, was already occurring. So in the Russian sciences, people were already like, that like weird English social Darwinist thing is just like so zany. We know about mutual aid and cooperation. We're really into that. And so when he, you know, kind of said this, like, as Graeber and Grubacic say in their introduction, like, people flipped against him and just like went for the text. And even like 20 years later, he's still getting harassed by people who are basically debate me bros, being like, Kropotkin, have you seen this latest science fact? I need you to respond to it. And just like endlessly demanding him to debate, which I can't even imagine how exhausting that was as like a 70-year-old dude living in Russia. And he's just kind of sitting there and he's like, I don't, you know, these English false Darwinists, like, they've been coming for me, but like, I literally don't care. I'm going to be proven right. And the only thing that is important is to keep yelling out, you know, like, enough with talking about competition and conflict. Like, it is a far greater factor in everything to have harmony and cooperation. So there's like kind of that big thing. And of course, like, that to anarchists is like, hell yeah, we're right. We don't need a state. Everything is better without state. But then, you know, you can also see the book, or rather to Kropotkin, right? Kropotkin also wrote it as part of these ongoing tensions within the broader radical scene at the time. And so he sees this both as a pushback against Marxism and Marxism's like particular view of history, which he refers to as metaphysically authoritarian, which is kind of like an amazing old-timey joke. And he also writes this as a response to what he's seeing as a rise of Nietzschean individualism and Nietzscheism. I can't pronounce things, everyone, I hope knows that by now, but like anti-moralism. So he doesn't like, so what Kropotkin is arguing against is a certain type of egoist individualism he sees popping up, and he's not he does argue for an anarchist individualism, but he sees himself as arguing for something different than what's coming out of like Nietzsche or even like Kant or something at the time. And so the book is also seen as like one of the first pieces in what would become like the rest of his life's work to explore morality and ethics, like what is morality and ethics. And this work like consumes him for the rest of his life. And he very sadly dies while completing his magnum opus on ethics. So I guess like we'll never know, right? Like we lost our chance to ever know what an anarchist ethics would be. In terms of how it was received, specifically in anarchism, we know that like, well, just like broadly, it was one of the best-selling popular works at the time. But also like within anarchism, it was quickly translated into a number of different languages, like almost immediately, even before it was like compiled into a book, even some of the essays were being translated. Japanese and Chinese anarchisms were greatly influenced by it and expanded on it greatly. One of his good friends, the anarchist martyr, Kotaku, was like a huge fan of it. We know it was also reprinted into many papers in India, in South America, just kind of like worldwide. It was translated and smuggled into Russia. Radical texts at the time were completely illegal. And that and the conquest of bread were very highly influential on the Russian anarchists. We have funny anecdotes that Makhno always carried like a copy around with him wherever he went. So like Makhno, even though he's running around with the black guards and stuff, has this little copy of mutual aid. But that doesn't mean that it didn't like create conversations among anarchists. People still pushed back on certain elements, like asked for clarification, was like, hey, are you being too essentialistic here? You know, kind of all of those normal conversations we would imagine. I mean, it's kind of like hard to think of anything longer than a single like kind of statement or sentence that's ever become canon in anarchist spaces. Like we have state bad, property theft, and abolish power, and that's like it. And those are like the only things that we hopefully don't argue on. Which is great about anarchism, right? Like being able to constantly engage in conversation. What we see less of in looking back in terms of anarchism, and this is something I find particularly interesting, is you don't really find as many anarchists detailing their projects as mutual aid projects. So they'll just kind of be like, oh, we do this with the value of mutual aid, not explicitly calling it like this is a mutual aid project, as we've kind of seen an explosion of in the last 2 years. So that's kind of like something that, I don't know, I've just like been reflecting on, like that huge change in language lately.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to take a moment to appreciate how weird it is that like Kropotkin's arch nemesis was like the great grandfather of like Aldous Huxley, the science fiction writer. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's
he had
too good.
Yeah, he had so many nemesis. It's like he's like remembered as this like loving, like nice man, but he was fighting with so many liberals and like conservatives. Like Kinna details a lot of these fights, and he's a very clever man in how he like puts his little put downs.
That's cool. I feel like I heard once that Kropotkin was translated by Chinese anarchists like a decade or more prior to anyone's translation of Marx, which like really set the like tone for like the Chinese left like early on. So the thing you were saying about like how prolific the translations were is really interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger tragedies that we can see when we look back into radical histories is that, you know, people saw the Russian Revolution worldwide as a success of a certain type of idea, because they did not understand like information about like the widespread horror and terror that was occurring there, you know, the Red Terror, like didn't get out. And so worldwide, you had a lot of people being like, oh, this is like the thing that wins. And it's just because like information really isn't getting out. You know, it took a lot of years for folks to find out how bad the political repression was like during the Red Terror. And so it's really after that that you start to see an explosion in a number of places of like Marxist ideas. So yeah, it's definitely a tragedy of like, I guess it would be this century. Oh, no, wait, last century. We're in the 2000s now.
Who can keep up? It all just happens so fast.
I know. I keep saying things like 2 years ago this happened, and then I'm like, oh no, that was 4 years ago. Like I forgot COVID.
So you mentioned kind of in passing some transitions in the way that we use the term mutual aid. And I guess I'm curious if you would want to expand at all on kind of, I guess, the contemporary use of the idea of mutual aid, because it's so central to anarchism that it's actually difficult to imagine like anarchism without it. But in addition to that, it feels like over the last couple of years, it has like crept into like liberalism, or maybe more that's that liberals have sort of like taken it and attempted to like make it their own. I just remember seeing that like AOC was like doing a like teach-in on mutual aid like in 2020, and I was just like, oh my God, mutual aid is having a moment. So what do you think about all that? Like, how has that engagement with mutual aid either, I don't know, pros and cons? What have you got?
What do I got? I mean, this is its own conference in itself, right? We could get so many great folks on here to be like, and another thing. So I guess like what I would say is, I mean, in terms of anarchist spaces, like it hasn't changed, right? Like, you know, mutual aid is like, just as Kropotkin says, it's like a factor in evolution, you know, so like a factor, right? So it's just a potential tendency whose examples are kind of endless, right? And it's practiced between all living things. So cooperation that is mutually beneficial can occur between ants or dogs or punks or graffiti writers, people who are incarcerated, and like, sadly enough, even cops and CEOs, right? But with like anarchists, our understanding is always mutual aid along with all of these other values, right? Like solidarity, freedom of association, a commitment against vertical or hierarchical relationships. So generally when we talk about mutual aid, it's always situated along those lines. But I mean, broadly, like, I don't even know anymore. Like you got AOC tweeting it out and holding a town hall. Like, what do you, like, what does that even mean? But I think that like, so we've seen a resurgence and recuperation of the term at the same time. But I think that resurgence has actually happened with the term being used attached to all of these anarchist principles, right? So when people are generally talking about mutual aid, they mention all of these other things, right? They mention like solidarity, something that like strengthens your relationship to other people to make you not reliant on a state, right? Or to even become something that like is able to challenge like the state itself. So I feel like that's kind of been an interesting thing to see. But I also think like, you know, so when crisis hit and people just spontaneously organized themselves to provide support and meet needs in order to mitigate the impacts, like, I highly doubt those millions of people were like familiar with mutual aid and were like, in checking on my neighbor, I have already read through the Russian sciences, the French sciences, and like, you know, like people just did that, which is like, you know, which just goes to show it's like a tendency and like a behavior that people often just like choose to engage in without needing to read anything about it. You know, as Kropotkin says, it's something that is like timeless and has so remote an origin, it couldn't even be traced. And I would say, you know, like that spontaneous mobilization, of course, like predated the resurgence of the word, right? That was like people coming in afterwards and being like, oh yeah, we know about this. This is mutual aid. Like, have you heard about this? Have you heard about the time the like Young Lords did this and like Common Ground did this and like, you know, all of this other stuff, like all of these things that, you know, people within like left liberatory politics like generally already know about. So, you know, anytime that like something becomes really popular, we're going to see like, you know, a bunch of people using it in a million different ways, right? Like I've seen people even say that like anarchists work with the FBI, anarchists like are like work with, I mean, this is like social media, right? So I'm not saying this is like these are like random like social media accounts saying it, but you know, even with the term anarchist, like it had a resurgence and then suddenly everybody had like a million different things. Oh, also you may hear my dog barking in the background. I'm gonna throw a couple treats and see. Oh, I might just need to pause for a second. Sorry, everyone.
No worries.
Yeah, so we see this like great resurgence of the term, and then we see this great recuperation of the term, right? And like, it's always going to bother me when I see folks who are like, I formed a 501c3 mutual anarchist business venture to clean up graffiti. You know, like that is going to drive. Oh, that's real. I see your face, Glinda. It's real. I'll send you pictures.
Oh, I remember the Twitter
graffiti.
discourse.
Please don't buff ACABs, everyone. That's like all, and call it mutual aid. ACABs are all we have. But you know, we wouldn't have seen such like a huge attempt to, you know, make the word mean a million different things or even recuperate it if like the core concept didn't have such an impact on people. And I think like just as Graeber and Grubacic speak in their introduction, when the book came out, it had a huge impact. And I honestly think that's partially because like, you know, if you hear as a person, you've been like told this whole time, this like social Darwinist bullshit that you got to hurt people and do all of this different stuff. And then somebody else comes along and is like, that's like absolutely zany. You don't have to fuck each other over to survive. You can just like go check on this other person and see like what they need. And then like maybe have a relationship on that. That's like a huge weight off of everybody's shoulders. So I kind of think just like when people saw that cooperation and then heard about this framework, you know, it was just like so celebrated. So, you know, we got the good of recuperation or the bad of recuperation and the good of resurgence. That's how they got to be put together.
So one more question just about the text itself. You know, when I revisit historic anarchist texts, say from the early 2000s, I am often struck by how our anarchist ancestors really had some blind spots in their analysis, or maybe had some pretty cringy ideas. So I'm wondering, given that this text is now 100 years old, kind of what readers might expect to find in it that feels regressive or doesn't really jive with like kind of the values and liberatory vision of contemporary anarchism.
Oh yeah. And I mean, it always kind of makes me think sometimes when I'm like, oh God, how will I be cringe in 100 years? How will we all be cringe in 100 years?
No,
like,
3 years. 3 years.
Oh God, yeah, 3 years. Yeah, I mean, oh, it's so, you know, I read a lot of just like even zines from like a couple years ago, and I'm like, oh, you know, we kind of use different language now. It's like cool to see that like we changed so fast in like just like 4 years, you know, So for anyone who is familiar with the text starts out with an introduction, right? And then mutual aid among animals, and then mutual aid among what Kropotkin details as savages, and then among what Kropotkin details as barbarians. And I think one of those words we don't really care about, though we also don't see it in use anymore, but one of those words we know is like a very harmful word when used today. And I really appreciate Ruth Kinna's kind of did a wonderful job of addressing this in the foreword of the book, like much more extensively than I ever could, mainly because Ruth Kinna is a lot smarter than me and remembers words better than me. No, oh my God, the amount of words that woman remembers. So, you know, as kind of mentioned above, in terms of like, you know, this book being an intervention within popular science, one of the things it was also an intervention into was this wide scale and popular adoption of something that Lewis Henry Morgan, this like old anthropologist, had called the ladder of civilization, doing scare quotes behind my tape over the screen. And this idea of the ladder of civilization had been adopted at such a wide scale. We even see it being used by like Engels and Marx when they're doing their whole like, first you have this, then you have this, then you have like full scale, you know, luxury gay space communism stuff, right? So this was like an incredibly agreed upon thing at the time. Though of course, right, there's like fights against it. Like whenever we see anything that was like wide scale adopted, we know that people were also like, no. So this is like a broad and popularly accepted idea of how humans, quote unquote, evolved, right? And it has this consequence, more than likely intended, of also crafting this linear narrative where folks can denigrate other forms of social arrangements and societal structures, as pretty much any linear conception of human history can, right? So Kropotkin is also trying to address this. And he's kind of like, okay, so we see these types of social groupings, arrangements, and peoples as somehow less. However, their tendency to cooperate and how they take care of each other and like all of the amazing things they do is so great. And you see him, he'll put these like these scare quotes around things, or he'll be like, we have the gall to call them not as good, right? And he does this in a way, though, that I think many of us today like easily recognize to be a way that like is harmful now, right? And I mean, was harmful back then, right? Like let's be clear, like things don't just like magically change. And I would say too, like kind of like you said, like these regressions and harms are present throughout so many of these older anarchist writers and conversations. Like one thing that always shocks me is seeing how like sex workers will be talked about or something like that. I'll always be like, whoa, like, and then be like, oh, I love living in 2021. Or just like anything, right? You just like constantly find these things that you're just like you really are just like separated from yourself for a second, because you're like, damn, I don't live when you lived. Like, so I think when we look back at texts, it's like an opportunity to do a couple of different things. One is to reflect on maybe how far we have come with as a scene. Like some of the things I see that are written on like sex workers or like eugenics or like even abortion, like they're not things I see in the scene, or if I do, they're like really fringe and people are immediately like, yo, no, like stop that. Like here are like 7 texts for you to read. So like you can see them as like moments of like celebration where you're like, yeah, we did a great job. Like we all came together and had conversations and really like do not think that thing anymore. Or you can see them as an opportunity to be like, these are things we have struggled with in our scene in the past. Misogyny, racism, paternalism, transphobia, homophobia, classism, on and on. Like these are all things that you're going to see in the past scene, but there are also things that still exist in our scene now, and we continue to struggle against them. And like certain people continue to experience them too, right? So, yeah, I guess celebrate how we've like what we've been able to accomplish like with each other, and also just like recognize like we still have things to accomplish and still have things to struggle against. But like I don't know, this is like kind of one of the things I just feel about anarchism. Like we're never really stagnant, and unlike some other political ideologies, we don't just like believe we've achieved anarchism. It's like a thing we constantly work and grow towards, in practice of. So yeah.
All right. So Bonzi, you come from a tradition of anarchist artists who work with their hands, who screen print and block print their own work for wide circulation. Can you talk a little bit about that tradition?
Oh yeah. And this is like, a huge tradition. Like there's lots of books written about this. Kathy Ferguson has a really cool one out. So I'll just like give just like my small perspective on it. And it's kind of also like a conversation about anarchist printing too. When you kind of look at the history of any radical group, like even some of the proto-anarchists like the Diggers or the Brethren of the Free Spirit, like printing presses and publishing is always an incredibly important focus. And repression so often comes down like on presses and their publications almost immediately. There's such like a huge history of just like presses being completely destroyed, which is so tragic because they're really beautiful equipment too. I think like a common practice in anarchism that I've at least experienced is one of prioritizing access, distribution, and proliferation. So if you're kind of like making visual art, it's pretty natural to explore mediums which lend themselves to these practices. And of course, we can see like parallels to other kind of DIY scenes like graffiti or punk, because pretty much everything we do is DIY. Like all of our projects, you know, whose project isn't held together with like spit and glue and a little bit of hope. So, you know, kind of printmaking just fits really well with that and with a lot of those aims. And as far as, you know, most of the mediums that you can work in, it's more accessible than most. At the time, I kind of learned from zines, but now there's just like endless YouTube videos you can watch, and they have like, you know, iPhone production values and fun jokes and like interesting lighting. And, you know, it's easier to learn now, I think, than ever. And also the imagery you kind of get when you're doing printmaking is usually pretty easy to either share or reproduce yourself through tracing. Like a lot of this stuff isn't like that complicated. I know I make more complicated imagery than I kind of like used to, but still I can just like, you know, if somebody hits me up in Indonesia because they want to use an image, I can just like email them a file and they can burn the screen and reproduce it exactly how I would reproduce it too. So, you know, it's kind of like hard to think of any political movement or campaign that hasn't busied itself with the production of imagery and texts. Like, you know, if you're doing something where your aim is making signs for folks, or you're doing a mass wheat paste campaign, printmaking is generally how you're going to achieve that. So you can look back at like the Diggers printing up their tracks and mass producing them, to the Paris Commune where you have wheat paste going up, forward to like 1900s Russia where anarchos are printing up like 10,000 flyers with a little graphic of a Ukrainian peasant fending off a landlord by throwing a bomb at them. Or even something now like the Center for the Study of Political Graphics, which is online and amazing for anybody who wants to see one of the most extensive catalogs of radical and political art throughout the years, like Center for the Study of Political Graphics. For me, I was really influenced growing up mainly by punk type stuff. So kind of like zines, flyers, stencils, and wheat paste that just have like generally like thousands of images in them, which sometimes have no author and are just like kind of meant to be interacted with or bootlegged, or maybe they're just like do tourneys of a comic panel of themselves. I've actually been really into bringing back some of the old Tank Girl images lately. Like we're really lacking Tank Girl patches and stickers in the scene, which I'm like, gotta bring that back. You know, I also just had this like weird moment the other day where that image of a multi-sided die crushing a cop car, I suddenly realized like that had an artist who has like a name with an Instagram I can follow. Like that's like an actual person I can just say hi to. It's not just like an image that lives within our like shared, you know, like image library in punk and anarchism. So that's kind of like how I was influenced growing up, is just like that history specifically within like punk of just like, you know, making lots of things, sharing them around. As I got older, I, you know, was really lucky to learn about people like Emory Douglas or the San Francisco Poster Brigade, Black Mask, Eric Drucker, you know, kind of all these folks who make really captivating imagery. And I mean, even to talk about like current anarchists working in that tradition would take like a 5,000 page, you know, like very nice coffee book or something.
Awesome. Thank you also for the tip about the Center for the Study of Political Graphics.
Oh my God, it's so good. Give yourself like a whole day.
I plan on it now.
Yes, okay. I'll send the link.
Sounds like something I really need to investigate.
Yeah.
What historical references and inspirations did you draw on as you were formulating the aesthetic for mutual aid?
Oh yeah. So the first kind of inspiration for this, or like the main inspiration for this, came from the works of the arts and crafts movement, who are a group of artists from the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. So these are folks like Walter Crane, William Morris, Florence Harrison, and just like so many others. And one of their projects was in establishing something called the Kelmstock Press, who made these like incredibly ambitious illustrated work, like fully illustrated works, pulling back to like, you know, these medieval illuminated texts. And they applied this aesthetic to things like works like The Tale of the Glittering Plain, which is one of like Morris's explorations of like utopia and socialism, to also the Kelmscott Chaucer, which is just like them illuminating the words of you know, that one guy, Chaucer, that very famous poet. And with Kelmscott and its participants, you have a current running that believed the quality and aesthetic of a text could help to amplify its words. And so just through that, they like produce so many beautiful things. And while a while back, I was reading more about the thoughts and politics of these artists. William Morris is somebody who I'm sure we've seen their patterning work like a million of times and maybe not even realized like he was a very famous and prominent socialist. Or Walter Crane, his images live with us, the garland for May Day, the Haymarket Martyrs piece, right? And, you know, he was also like a very, very prominent socialist and like person at his time. So I pretty extensively bootlegged Morris and Crane. There's like a bunch of like direct ripoffs of them in there. I mean, I changed a couple things up. But I also kind of went back and tried to reference a number of old medieval woodblocks, especially in the chapters in Mutual Aid about the guilds. I tried to find ways that guilds themselves represented themselves. And I attempted to find older illustrations representing peasants' movements and uprisings and just kind of like take a pose and a dress of a figure and put it into another piece. So this incredibly nerdy stuff that doesn't like mean anything. It's just like, you know, stuff I did. I looked at a lot of anarchist illustrators and other contributors to the publications during Kropotkin's times. You know, anarchist publishing has always been a huge thing. We've always had lots of papers, and, you know, looking back towards like Kropotkin's time, there's like so many of these papers and they all included like really beautiful illustrations, just as today, you know, in zines, like people are putting in so much cool, fun stuff. So I bootlegged a lot of those people too.
What has changed, do you think, in the relationship that anarchists have to art over the last century?
I think like we've stayed consistent, but art itself has so massively changed. Like, was just joking the other day about like, how would you explain an NFT to an anarchist artist from like 60 years ago? Like, they flip on you, like if they could even understand, right, like what was going on. So we've been consistent. We're good. You know, I'm most familiar with the last 100 years or so of those kind of conversations. So, you know, over a century ago, you're having these like major industrial pushes occurring. More folks are being pushed into factories who maybe had been living in more like rural or pastoral areas, or just even having like more free time themselves. And so a lot of like anarchist kind of like critiques or even like thoughts on art are rooted within what they see as like a denigration of art or craftsmanship itself. So they're looking at art kind of as this thing that, you know, you have the time to create something through which you're able to introduce a fair amount of individual or collective expression, right? This could be like a plate, a bowl, a painting, a wood clock, like anything, right? But it's just something that you have time to work on and like include this individual expression in. And you're doing this because the experience itself is mostly pleasurable. And the purpose of making it is because it's either going to be hopefully enjoyed by others, or maybe even just have some like form of use that's just aesthetic. And there's like this current running through here, which is pushing back on what they see as, so while like the art that people just engage in, kind of what we would call craftsmanship now, or crafts, right? Like looming and weaving, right? We're like, oh, that's something that like, you know, middle-aged boring people do together. And I'm like, what? Quilts are awesome. Like quilts are so cool. So like they're seeing this, and then at the same time, they're seeing more of a push for art to only be made by, you know, quote unquote, like learned men of who the Academy have called artists, right? So it's more moving into this space of like museums and like rich people and schools decide who's an artist. So they're pushing back on the destruction of art being something that like anyone could engage in, and art also being a part of like everyday experience. So there's also all of these like huge critiques of museums that are like very wide ranging and even go into like oh, did you just figure out how to make it autoplay? That's so cool. Yeah, Ash. So, and you know, these critiques of museums, you even find them in thinkers like John Dewey, who's not an anarchist, but was like friends with tons of anarchists, and like, you know, they're pretty much the same. And then also have like components of like, these are like horrible imperial, you know, repositories of just like violence and destruction, right? And even when you like flip forward to like the 1960s or something, you have like groups like Black Mass who are trying to like shut down the MoMA. And so they're pulling that thread along that like museums aren't living celebrations of the creative urge, but they're merely repositories for rich people's baubles. They have this like flyer from when they tried to they did shut down the MoMA, I should say, from when they did shut down the MoMA. And it says, "We sing of your death, destroy the museums, our struggle cannot be hung on walls. God damn your culture, your science, your art, your mass murder cannot be concealed." So they're also responding to, you know, the MoMA at the time. A number of the people who funded or sat on the board of the MoMA directly profited off of the violent invasion and occupation of Vietnam. And, you know, nowadays we see they're profiting off of oil pipelines and people are splashing red blood on their stairs, which is just so wonderful and lovely to see. So, you know, we're basically seeing just like a continual critique of like anything that takes art away from everyday life, anything that, you know, doesn't celebrate like the individual creative urge, anything that just like tries to remove art and make it only for rich people, and just like, I don't know, like just makes art a separate sphere of experience. So I think that's pretty much stayed consistent, though we've constantly had to change as like, you know, holy shit, like art can be used to like directly fund the Vietnam War. What the hell is that? Or like with NFTs, like, I'm not even going to get into them. Everybody knows what everybody thinks about. Sure, anyone listening or sitting here is on the same page. One thing I do think that's interesting in anarchism is there's always been an ongoing tension with a militant kind of like anti-aestheticism. So where to like kind of struggle means to like consecrate yourself to the cause in a way where you deny all other pursuits. So like you can't have nice shirts, you can't eat like good food, right? You have to just be like you gotta struggle. And so like that militant anti-aestheticism, and then just like folks who are like, nah, I'm doing this so everybody can have nice shit, so everybody can have like live joyful lives where the fulfillment of their creative potential, like they're able to meet that. And I feel like currently, like, I feel really lucky. I could just be in a bubble, but I see more and more of that embracing of nice shit for everyone, right? And less of this, like, live in a concrete bunker and eat gruel until Rev, which is just like, I don't know, why would you do that? Like, let's have nice shit for everybody. You know, Graeber has this funny quip in Bullshit Jobs where he's like, writing bad poetry or being in a bad cover band is literally so much better and worthwhile than anything a person is doing at a bullshit job. And I just like really feel that, right? Like any type of like fulfillment of that is, you know, like most of the time these bullshit jobs he's identifying are generally socially harmful, but it's also just like, you know, I feel a good thing. Uh-oh, Somebody must be at our door. I'm so sorry, everyone. Thank you for your patience with the dogs. Hey, ladies. But anyways, nice shit for everybody. Like, let's not go back to a militant anti-aestheticism, but let's also make sure that what we're doing prioritizes like the creative potential of everyone. Oh, and we should still shut down the MoMA. Like, that thing needs to go.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. I was very curious. I come from like a background of working in like a few art institutions, and as someone that identifies like as anarchist adjacent or an anarchist, I'm just like, I like think about myself in these spaces where someone like me is typically like frowned upon being there. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think really wonderful. Like, I don't want to say like, oh, all museums are doing bad things, because like museums are made up of people who are doing amazing things too, right? Like sorry if that was like, you know,
no.
like a little too harsh. Okay. Yeah, like there's still, in every one of these institutions, like there's still like, they're all still made up of people. And to, you know, it's just a level of like, you know, there's so many different types of galleries, right? Like I think about like people showing in like a cafe gallery as opposed to like, I don't know, like the Louvre or something like that. Like those are worlds different. How can we even see them as the same thing? Oh no, they're still barking.
Oh.
I'm like off screen, I'm feeding them treats like every second.
Oh. So I have one last question. In your note in the book, you emphasize that everything you produce is basically free to be bootlegged. Have you taken a financial hit as an artist, as opposed to like opposed to intellectual property, and how do you like survive without it?
Oh yeah, no, or I don't think so. I kind of almost have like no clue how to quantify it. Like, you know, do I quantify my art I do based on the cash value I can extract from it? Or do I quantify my art by the experience of making it and kind of being able to play around with images and explore themes? And doing something incredibly fiddly, like punk printing, like even doing the thing that takes like 2 years to figure out that you're miserable over, right? Like I really enjoy that type of stuff. Or like, you know, is like the joy in it seeing someone else has made their own version of something of mine that I probably grabbed from Walter Crane, that he probably grabbed from somebody in the 1600s, and then like we pasted that up, right? You know, I find a lot of joy from making art, even the aspects where I struggle for a while. I really like the idea of a collaborative and creative commons for all, where we can all kind of use or build off of or inspire each other's work. Like it's really hard for me to think of being able to make things in a vacuum. And I'm incredibly influenced by like everything I've seen or like conversation I've had, like music, movies, music, quotes, on and on. Like it's really hard for me to think of producing stuff outside of that. And you know, also when I talk about like a collaborative and creative commons and like the destruction of intellectual property, I think that you know, some folks sometimes like worry about like what does that look like in terms of power relationships, like especially power relationships where certain folks are still experiencing the active ongoing like extraction you know, from their cultures and from their communities. And like I just want to say, I like don't think the destruction of intellectual property does not protect people, right? Like it protects like corporations for the most part. And with its destruction, I think we still, you know, are very focused on like what do those power relationships look like in terms of people who are like experiencing harm or experiencing extraction. As far as like how I make it, or like, you know, how do I survive without it, right? Like I screen print a lot of like to the level that I'm in physical therapy, you know, like if you're a young screen printer, please watch your posture. And I do a fair amount of contracted manual labor. Also, if you're a manual laborer, please watch your posture. Your physical therapist will yell at you someday. And I've been like really incredibly lucky that folks have provided so much support for kind of like the goofy little punk patches and poster I make. In addition to, you know, just the jobs we all get by on, right? Like we're all working a job of some sort. I think a big struggle for anyone making art right now is kind of like, if you're specifically saying like, I'm an anarchist artist, right? Like I am a person who has like the values of an anarchist and I'm making art, right? It's, you know, kind of resisting the trap of careerism. So when you see your actions and passions as like a career, rather than as a space where your politics are playing out, or not even your politics, your values are playing out or being explored, or even just having like a good time and doing stuff that's interesting to you, you're going to find yourself in more situations where you could potentially have to sacrifice some of the things you believe in. And if it's like, you're just interested in building your career, then why not take that commission from Chevron, who wants you to do some greenwashing, you know, of their like business? Because, you know, technically that's a good thing. It builds your career, right? You'll get more commissions or whatever. And there's already like so many things we struggle with day to day living in the world where we're trying to like make decisions of like how to do less harm and like how to maybe even participate less in harmful things. Like, you know, do I respect this boycott even though I really need to go in here? Like, yes, I respect the boycott, like it's necessary. And if you're focused on the idea of prioritizing a career over all else, like shit's gonna get hard to stay consistent. And you know, also I guess I would just end with, you know, like it's anarchism. We have quips like, may the last judge be strangled by the entrails of the last copyright lawyer. Like that's pretty straightforward.
Well, all right. I think that's a wrap to sort of our prepared questions. So I don't know if Glenda or Liberty, you have anything else you want to ask. I mean, I will. Bonzo, I think, you know, typically a question to ask at this point is there anything coming up for you that's next? I think in my first question, we named the fact that there are so many texts out there that could be updated with illustrated versions. And I was curious at that point to ask if there were something else that you could work on. I don't know if that's an endeavor that you plan to take on anytime soon, but if there were something else you could illustrate, what would it be? And is there anything coming up for you down the line that viewers should know about?
Yeah, I am, oh golly. So I have made a decision not to illustrate another text, but to write and illustrate another text. And I just want to say it's really unfair Kropotkin's dead and can't get back here and write this new thing for me. So I decided to embark upon a small history of anarchist women between about like 1900 to 1950. As I kind of mentioned, like even when talking about Kropotkin, like the scene is thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and the drama they had is amazing. Really excited about getting into all that. But you know, it's often you know, it's not even that I think so much that like women are overlooked in it or whatever, but it's just kind of like there's so many fascinating stories and so many like fascinating people who were all engaged in you know, this really courageous and risk-taking work, right? Like even just looking back at the Russian Revolution, and they're all having conversations, I think too, that so many of us can even find important today. I just did a bunch of the Russian women, so you might have heard me dropping all of this like Russian Revolution like stuff throughout this text. So that's, in 2.5, 3 years, but I'm also so excited about doing it and excited about finding some of these women who I wouldn't say have been hidden from history, but maybe not like celebrated to the extent that we've celebrated other people. So if you follow me like on Instagram or Twitter or anything like that, like I'm going to be posting a bunch of like portraits and different illustrations of some of the historical experiences that they had. So, but that'll be 2.5 years of my life.
Who knows where we'll be at that point.
But still here. Everybody cross your fingers. We'll be doing awesome.
Liberty, Glenda, anything else you wanted to ask?
This has been a great conversation, and there were so many threads that we could pull on, but I feel like in fairness to Bonzi, we should probably call it a wrap for tonight, and perhaps we'll get into some of those pieces in person at some point in the future. I love the suggestion that maybe at some point we will feel secure enough in our COVID protocols, or perhaps we will move past this moment and get to actually do a version of this IRL. So thank you so much for being here tonight. It's been really lovely. Also, I decided art is good.
Yes.
Thanks to all the folks in attendance who came tonight. Anyone who registered for this event will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to the event. So, this was a really wide-ranging conversation, and Bonzo had so much to share. If there was anything you missed or want to go back and hear again, we'll be posting this conversation to our YouTube channel. And also I have dropped links in the chat, both to the book we talked about tonight, Mutual Aid, also to Bonzo's other merch that we carry at Firestorm that includes stickers and patches, a lot of the art that was on the PowerPoint slides tonight. We have material copies of in the forms of patches and stickers. So yeah, thank you so much, Bonzo.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was absolutely so much fun. Also, congratulations, Glenda, again on joining the co-op. And I'm excited. I know this is going to be kind of weird, but I'm excited to join you in a couple of days to see your upcoming conversation with William C. Anderson. Yeah, but thank you so much. And yeah, I hope sometime in this year or the next year we can all be in person together.
Thank you.
Have a great night, y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.